yes, there is this government support, but I think what was really new to me was learning how much of the recent developments have really been driven by, sort of capitalist-like competition adapted to the local environments.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. This episode is different. We're tackling China's energy transition, and instead of the three of us just talking about it, we each went out and interviewed different experts. Then we came back together to discuss what we heard. Why China? Because it's arguably the most important energy story on the planet right now. China is the world's largest emitter. It's also the world's largest investor in clean energy. It manufactures the lion's share of solar panels, batteries, and now electric vehicles in the world. Functionally, what happens there determines whether the world has any real shot at meeting long-term climate targets. So we wanted to get beyond the headlines. David spoke with Andrew Light, distinguished professor at George Mason University and former senior climate official in the Biden administration. Sara talked with Jeremy Wallace, professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins, and Christina Pan, a PhD candidate at Cornell, researching renewable energy in China. And I interviewed Hong Li, a professor at the Institute of Physics at the Chinese Academy of Sciences and an expert on battery chemistry. 3 different perspectives, followed by the three of us trying to make sense of it all. Let's start with David and Andrew Light.
Maybe going way back to China, and as I recall, during the Trump 1, you ran a kind of track 2 for World Resource Institute with China.
Right.
So what would you say are the big factors that made China so successful in clean energy, especially solar and batteries?
The Chinese have wanted energy independence for a long time, for all the reasons that any country would want energy independence, which is because it's energy security. So that's partly number one, is they wanted to, as India does, as many other sort of major powers do, they want to get off of this roller coaster of being kind of at the mercy of oil prices, the fluctuations, which sometimes make sense, but oftentimes do not, that are sort of the result of geopolitical events that cannot be controlled. And people can think back of all the examples in the last couple of years that sort of demonstrated that. And I think the same thing is true for natural gas. They don't want to sort of get beholden to countries like the United States on LNG and kind of things like this. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two, I think that they absolutely saw exactly what I just described, that there are many other countries in their position that want to sort of move into some degree of energy independence. And in this world where most countries are not fossil energy producers and exporters like the United States, the most sure way to independence, if you can afford the transition, right, is going to be to do it your own, is to electrify everything and to go into some kind of renewable. So I think that that's what drove a lot of it, is they had an internal need they wanted to take care of.
What's your sense for solar in particular? I kind of feel like I've heard different stories. One story is that it was really a strategic decision, that they made a bet and it turned out to be the right bet. But the other story is that, that Germany started with this huge program that bought a lot of solar. Some Chinese manufacturers jumped in and started succeeding without particularly big government push. And then once the train was rolling, the Chinese government saw a good thing going and jumped on. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I think it was. If you go back and you look at the history of the 5-year plans, right? There's a continuity and a thread through there where you're looking for, again, energy independence, energy resilience, but lots of ideas. Not all of them were, basically electrifying everything and getting, you couldn't, if you go back and you look like 3, 4, 5-year plans ago, you would not have predicted what you see in Beijing today, which is like half of all the cars on the road are electric, right? You just wouldn't.
Exactly. When I was working with the folks at Princeton, the Carbon Mitigation Initiative people, I met a bunch of people from China in those days, kind of 20 years ago, who really believe there's going to be coal gasification, coal to liquids at giant scale. They're going to manage their world, they manage their oil import constraint by gas to liquids. Obviously, that's totally a joke now.
That's right. That's right.
What about on nuclear? So my understanding is you at least had some role with your DOE hat on the Biden administration in understanding the relationship between what China is actually building and Westinghouse's AP1000 design and how to think about licensing. So I don't know what you can say publicly, but I'm really interested to understand like what, how excited you are about the China nuclear build out, which looks pretty exciting to me. And do they contemplate exports?
Two things I'd want to say about this. One is a little, and bear with me, a short anecdote. At the COP, the sort of the UAE COP a few years ago, at the big climate summit, I led the push with some partners in the UAE to create this tripling nuclear pledge by 2050. John Kerry, was the U.S. lead for launching that at the COP. At the actual meeting, I was on a panel on nuclear with a few, interesting people. And one of them was a major, figure, sort of a very senior guy in the Chinese nuclear corporation. And he said to me, he goes, "Oh yeah, you worked on the tripling nuclear pledge and helped to put that club together." And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Yeah, we looked at that and we realized that's too small a target for us." Right. So it was just sort of like, he's like, that's cute, right? That you want to sort of like move towards the world tripling nuclear by 2050, but our plans already outstrip that. So we didn't want to sign on to something that made us look weaker. So that's point number one. Mm-hmm. They're committed there. And yeah, it's not going to be pretty with respect to the IP issues and stuff like that. I worked a whole lot on the resolution of those between Korea and Westinghouse in my last couple of years in office. This one will be way, way harder. And really, it's going to be, I think, up to Westinghouse in terms of determining how they want to handle this, because it's a much tougher customer. The second thing, though, is on the export thing. So there we're seeing really mixed signals. You don't see, unlike the Koreans, for example, you're not seeing a lot of appetite to build in other parts of the world. You're not seeing a lot of appetite to get into tenders. There have been some indications of that before on the large plants, right? And there have been sort of indications in a few small countries in Europe where the Chinese were early on kind of looking to be part of the process. And my read on it is that a determination was made. We don't want to go with China. They didn't want to go with Russia, wanted to push Russia out of these tender bids at the same time for obvious reasons. And then they were just sort of like, okay, the Chinese, as far as I could tell, did not do a full court press to try to push to get themselves back into the mix, which is unlike what we saw with some other countries. On the other hand, and the other sort of point on this that I find curious and I don't quite understand, I mean, of course, the sort of the magic, word is small modular reactors. Everyone wants to get into small modular reactors. The U.S. has invested heavily in that. The Trump administration is actually doing now a lot more aggressive things than we were doing in the Biden administration to try to jumpstart SMRs in some interesting ways. Some of ways which they will get some pushback on. Some of ways which I would absolutely fully support. As far as we can tell, the Chinese are going to get there first, right? To not just operationalizable SMRs, which we have, but commercializing ones. And the indications that I've seen are they're not looking to get into a big export market on SMRs. Why that is the case, I don't know. And I mean, there may be some China watchers out there who have far greater insight into this, but I think it's part of sort of like almost a parallel to the dynamic you identified correctly, I believe, on solar. It's like the planning process has got to see some wins, some reasons to get the internal machinery working and moving in that direction, and then move forward on it. And the indications are now that that's kind of like not something they're looking for on big export with it. It could simply be as prosaic as this, skepticism that there's actually going to be a successful big export market for these things. We've been talking about it. It's been driving so much innovation. But, I mean, the on the one hand, it's sort of like, the people put it down to no one wants to be the first adopter. I think we're probably getting over that pretty soon. And I think Canada may be one of the first places, right, where we sort of see that.
Yep.
But then after the first adopter, where's the order book?
This is what, I mean,
where's the order book? And
a little bit.
The Chinese might just be going like, "Where's the order book?" Like,
yeah, everybody talks about SMRs, but if the SMRs that are close to being built now are all basically just smaller light water reactors, and it's personally not obvious to me that they actually make sense. Maybe existing light water reactors are a little bit too big, but it's not clear that making them that much smaller is going to actually make them more economic.
The market could be really niche.
Yeah.
Like one of the very last things that I did in office in the Biden administration was to sign an intergovernmental agreement with Lithuania on nuclear. And they've been going back and forth on nuclear ever since the European Union basically, required them to dismantle a legacy, Soviet reactor as part of their kind of like new energy plan. And that's all done, and it's kind of moving forward. And then they've had, very different public opinions on it. Finally, they got a government that wanted to move forward on it, and it looked like enough public support on it. And so for a country like Lithuania, they don't need a big, giant light water reactor. Maybe they can see a place for a load balancing SMR. But that's a pretty small market for the kind of investment in the supply chain to produce these things at scale.
Okay, maybe one last question. I mean, so you spent the Biden administration as the top foreign policy official at US DOE, but you must have been obviously talking a lot with the people inside the kind of domestic side of DOE.
Absolutely.
What like of these markets that China's now dominating, solar, a bunch of battery markets, if you were going to have one of those that you hope the U.S. or more generally the West would grab back or compete successfully with China on, which one would it be and why?
There's two buckets, I'd say. In terms of the existing buckets, I'd sort of say if we were really, really, really going to get serious about trying to build a domestic supply chain on something that China already dominates on, it's batteries. The bad news is, of course, is like the EV credit went away, and so you've got like less of a drive on EV batteries, but the credits when it comes to utility scale batteries are still there. And so you've got basically, supply chains, and you've got other kinds of things which can overlap a little bit. Technology will be different, all these kinds of things. And so batteries would be key, with one caveat for where I think the Trump administration is being extremely smart. And the second thing is just to go in a different direction. Advanced geothermal, kind of things like that, which if the U.S. does have the technology, the U.S. does have the expertise, you can sort of pivot away from our expertise on deep drilling and fracking and all that kind of stuff to perfect that technology, and then figure out like, well, what is the export part of it? There's can be a lot domestically needs to be done, but then, so it's got to be that category thing. There's other than geothermal, but that's the one that easiest come to mind. On the battery side, I'd sort of say the absolute key though, of course, is critical minerals and materials. Like if the Chinese continue to have a lock on that, then, I mean, you can only build a domestic supply chain that works on that. You either got to do it in partnership with the Chinese and find a way to do that was palatable. And we were sort of doing all kinds of contortions to figure that out in the Biden administration. And I don't know whether the Trump administration is going to make that possible or not. It's still there. It's incredibly complicated, but it's still there. But that will be as long as you classify China as a foreign entity of concern, which will not go away, you're always going to have that hesitancy. What the Trump administration is doing now, I wish we would have done and started to do in 2021, investing in this as a country. I mean, the biggest hurdle I ever faced in the Department of Energy, competing on nuclear, competing on any tender, on any energy process in the world, is that we don't own anything. We don't own any company.
Really interesting. So you're saying that what Trump administration is doing right is actually putting cash investments into critical minerals.
That's exactly right. That is the smart thing to do. And if it means that the government's going to take part ownership in those things, which is something the United States government does not generally do, so be it. I mean, I think it's the smart thing to do. I had worked out sort of a deal, to try to use the strategic defense stockpile, partly for civilian uses on critical minerals. It kind of got there, but there were lots of hiccups and, there's sort of legal difficulties in working this out in terms of the agreement. But we were getting there, and we were also encouraging the International Energy Agency to encourage other countries to consider stockpiling in the same way that we stockpile. All IEA members have to stockpile a certain amount of oil, right? So we can do these collective actions in the case of supply cuts. what the Trump administration is doing now about getting really serious, and, I don't care about the framing that they put it under. There's obviously some overlap of defense needs there that will drive it. So be it. If it gets the U.S. government serious about investing in the stuff which would be, you have to have access to in order to have any hope of building a battery supply chain, whether it's EVs or utility scale, that's essential. And so I applaud them for it.
All right, up next we have Sara with Jeremy Wallace and Christina Pan.
Sitting here in Canada, it was quite impressive to see the rise of EVs in China. I think it's fair to say that China's EV adoption is unmatched globally. I'm wondering what you think about what lessons the West can take from China's rapid scale up, and in that, what would and wouldn't work in the West as well, too.
I think one of the first achievements or explanations for China's EV adoption that I noticed in China is the widespread of the charging station. And as actually I have a statistics, which actually I didn't know before. So it's like by October 2025, there are 18.64 million chargers in China. That was like really impressive. But on the other hand, I also checked this data on Canada's side. There are 35,000 charging stations across Canada right now. So that contrast is pretty huge and really shocking. I think China have done a lot to engage the local government and also the private sector to build the charging station. Previously, in the early stage of EV development, EV industry development around 2009, I think China's central government was trying to ask the local government and state-owned power companies to help construct the charging station. But later on, around 2014 to 2016, the central government actually allowed the private sector to enter this area. So that was a really big factor or a big explanation for a driver for the widespread quick development of the EV charging station. And now the entire sector, the charging station sector, has entered I would say, industrial consolidation stage. So now it has been monopolized and dominated by pretty big charging station companies.
So I'm assuming that many EV owners are living in cities in apartments, so they don't have their own parking spaces in their garages or something. Are there a lot of charging stations in apartment buildings themselves, or do they tend to be more in public kind of accessible? And do you know the ownership structure of those chargers in the apartments? Are those also actually privately owned?
So that's a very good question, because one thing that really shocks me is a lot of people or a lot of residents in Canada or the UK and the US, they charge their EVs in their own garage. And that is hardly to see in China, because most of the time the charging stations are in the public garage, and is ran by usually those are charging companies, right? Privately built, but some are publicly built. But actually, the privately built charging station are quite large, but it's like still shared by the public. The public usually need to go into some app. And then it's kind of like you pay for parking tickets in the US, but in the China, people go to the app and pay for their charging.
Maybe, Jeremy, over to you. Are there other lessons that you see from China's rapid scale up of EVs in addition?
I mean, I think the baseline expectation is that these cars are cheaper, cleaner, and better than ICE vehicles in today already. And so the idea that we should wonder about adoption is a bit surprising, especially from a Chinese perspective, where it's just very clear that these are cheaper, cleaner, and better, and and of course that's the choice that consumers will make. The fact that how that came to be, how these cars that were seen as kind of futuristic or difficult to imagine or just kind of not existent a decade ago or 2 decades ago became this better option, better consumer option is, I think, a lot of the story. And there's definitely a governmental role there along the lines of subsidies that Christina was talking about and the infrastructure, which I think is really quite critical. But in large part, it's because of really cutthroat competition between various EV firms inside of China competing to make cars that the Chinese consumer would be interested in buying and creating. Because there was a plethora of companies, there was a plethora of models and a plethora of variety of kind of like at variety of cost points. So there's like luxury vehicles, but there's also super small kind of city cars that have variety of technologies. There was just a lot of different. It was a big sea, and there were a lot of fish in that sea, and some of those fish have been swallowed by larger fish. I don't know how far I want to go down this metaphor, but it was a very strong competitive environment that led to technical developments and improvements with better battery life, the transition from NMC batteries to LFP batteries, the kind of like lithium iron phosphate batteries that have become dominant in China is just a kind of a step change where this was seen as a worse technology, but a cheaper one. And so that would never be attractive. But if it's much cheaper and only a little bit worse in terms of energy density, then it's a huge win. And so that's a major development that I think has allowed to EV adoption to spiral. And so I think there's this really, it's a pretty great story. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen the adoption in other countries is that they're not allowing their citizens to pay kind of market prices for these cars, these Chinese-made vehicles, because of concerns about local domestic auto sectors and so on, which have real political reasons behind them. So I think a simple answer to how to improve EV adoption in the rest of the world is to allow the rest of the world to buy Chinese EVs. But that has all these really messy knock-on political consequences. And I think thinking through what that might mean is kind of the task of today.
Is it fair to say that hasn't happened so much in, say, the U.S. or Canada because of? I mean, it's hard not to see the incumbent automakers as sort of protecting their existing stock. Is that a fair explanation?
I think that's fair, and I think we had all kinds of explanations about the efficient size of an automaker in the West being kind of like of a sufficient scale. And we just didn't have a lot of new entrants coming in, with Tesla being the big exception. I mean, people talk about EVs as it's basically like a phone with wheels and seats. And lots of people in China, companies thought that they could make phones and thought that they could make various other things. So a lot of entrants came in part because of government support, like Christina said, but in part because it was a new area. It is a capitalist story in the sense that these are like entrepreneurs seeing a market opportunity, pushing kind of like reducing costs in order to win for market share and competition, putting profits down to zero in ways that like work the way that capitalism in some ways is supposed to work, which I think is a surprising story for the West thinking about China. To learn about capitalism from China is a kind of a little bit hard for people to imagine.
That explanation, it also makes me think of kind of how, that in the incumbent automakers, you have more of almost like an evolutionary process that's creating these EVs as opposed to the bottom-up design of a new EV that doesn't come from the constraint of the way that they're, a new entrant is already thinking about a vehicle. So,
and it's stealing their profits, right? Like Ford makes a huge amount of money off of every EV or off of every gas truck that they sell. And if they start selling these EVs that are much less profitable for them, it's hard to really get behind a transition in that way. This is the classic creative destruction story, right? Like it's really hard to have your business kind of like transition from something that you do well and that you're a leader in that is very profitable to something that you just know you're not as good at and it's not going to be as profitable. It's hard to really push the institution in that direction.
What do you think China's emissions will be in 2040 compared to today? And you could, by what fraction will that decrease? What will that pathway look like?
Theoretically, China previously has made that commitment. They would peak emissions by 2030. So that means if they can fulfill that commitment, their emissions will definitely be decreasing in 2040 compared to today, right? And but actually, the statistics showed this year the emissions in China had kind of showed slow down or plateaued, given the rise of the solar and the wind installment from the electricity generation. What fraction it will decrease? One of my guesses is about the real estate, because previously, like China has a lot of emissions from the real estate construction. However, with the housing prices have going down rapidly, and there is a decline in the real estate construction activities, I might expect the emission from the steel, from the cement, and other building materials might keep falling in the future.
And as Christina said, I think the first question is when is the peak? And I think we're likely to see 2024 last year be a peak. If this year emissions begin to decline, I think it's quite possible that they will not ever reach the level that they reached in 2024, or maybe this year, if it turns out we're really plateauing, and so like tiny increments up or down kind of could be a peak, but it doesn't look like a dramatic peak of any mountain that you'd want to climb. So I think we're really around the peak right now, and so 2040 feels like 15 years from now, and that feels like a lot of time, and so I could see a lot of progress. And so I think my initial reaction is something, well, if 2060, which is the time that China has promised to be carbon neutral, if we kind of think about the time frame, well, then 1/3 of emissions kind of like being kind of like reduced, that feels like kind of approximately where you would want to be. And if anything, that's a little kind of like pushing it out. I'm in finals mode for my students. And so the students that have only finished 1/3 of their papers, right? Like, anyway, they should have done more. But I think the other interpretation is that China's NDC just officially, that they released this right before the COP, had its 2035 target is only 7 to 10% emissions reduction from peak. And it didn't even say when that peak was. And so if you think about that, well, then to go from 10% decline to 33% decline in just 5 years doesn't make a lot of sense either. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in this space. I think that the technologies are available, and that China does have a really attractive path to reduce emissions quite substantially, quite quickly, in ways without a lot of costs. Because as Christina said, the cheapest electricity in the world is Chinese kind of solar and wind. And if that can be displacing other kind of fossil fuels in the power sector, but also other industrial processes that can be electrified, as we're seeing more and more, then I think you could have a real rapid decrease in emissions from the power sector, as well as kind of China's electrifying its economy quite substantially. This language of China being an electro state and all these other things. I think I'm probably hopeful that something like emissions down 1/3 of their current peak by 2040 is something that I would hope that China could reach, and China would reach. I think it's certainly optimistic, but I don't know how you get to carbon neutral by 2060 if you don't progress at least at that pace. And so it's because the easiest emissions to cut are going to be these. It's going to be really hard to do all of the things that we know are really hard, right? That agriculture probably being the hardest, right? Reducing emissions from agriculture, which are substantial in China, not as substantial as in other parts of the world, including Canada, but it's still a huge amount of emissions. And I don't know what the solution to Chinese pig farming and rice growing is going to be, how you're going to reduce those emissions.
I heard from both of you that whether it's exactly this year or next year, it seems like China is on track, or even more than on track, to reach their goal of peaking emissions by 2030. I'm curious about kind of what's behind a lot of this. So, to what extent is China's energy transition driven by climate goals at the front versus, some combination of industrial policy or energy security and geopolitical competition?
Actually, my answer is not either all. It's like it's actually, the answer is a combination of all these factors. And I think this is actually just a characteristic of China's approach to clean energy transition or climate mitigation. The fact that the Chinese government use climate policies, industrial policy, and energy policies, they're intertwined, and they're using the co-benefits of, for example, energy policies to achieve, or industrial policies to achieve their climate goals. I think that's like a very interesting characteristic of China's approach. And specifically, for example, in the EV development, so in the early stage, when Chinese government decided to support the EV development, I think the energy security is a primary driver, because there has always been a concern for Chinese central government as they rely mainly on oil imports. So developing the EVs is one of the solutions for Chinese government to reduce their reliance on the oil. But on the other hand, development EV is also definitely driven by the industrial policies, and the Chinese government has provided at different levels, provide all those subsidies to the firms and also to the consumers to support the EV industries. Since the Chinese government were worried that they can't compete for ICE vehicles with the foreign companies in early 2000, especially after China's accession into the WTO. So, and also I think what's interesting about the EV development is it's also, part of it can also be attributed to Chinese concern about air pollutions. So, and that is not being raised in the question, but I think that's a really important factor, because in early 2000, when this is actually the first EV policies the Chinese government initiated, it's called 10 city, 1,000 vehicles. Jeremy and I should also know, but would know about this, because this is like the first demonstration project for Chinese government to adopt. And most of the city got selected. The reason why most of those cities were selected is because the high level of air pollution that these cities have, and the Chinese government want to use this pilot program as a tool to see, as a policy tool to see if it has helped to address air pollution. So I think, it's definitely a combination of these factors. And another thing I said, I would say the climate goal would be the much last factor the Chinese government consider when thinking about developing those clean energy manufacturing industries. As a backdoor story, so in 2015, when Chinese government made a commitment of capping the CO2 emissions at the Paris Climate Agreement, and this commitment was actually based on a calculation by a Tsinghua University Research Institute on clean energy development or climate mitigation. So this institute released a report to the Chinese government, and this is a roadmap for China to capping the CO2 emission. And they predicted that China would be on its way to cap its CO2 emission based on the existing clean energy development. So I would say it's actually the industrial policies, energy policies, and come first, and then drives the Chinese clean energy transitions. And that helped China to actually commit to more international, ambitious climate goals.
I guess I'll say two things that, beyond just echoing what Christina's points were. One is that I think climate change and the reality of a climate crisis going forward underlies a lot of the action, in the sense that a lot of the private firms kind of in China jumped on European subsidies at the beginning in order kind of to move in, like kind of develop these industries and then reduce costs, which makes them more attractive, which makes them grow and so on. So I think from especially like the solar and wind and maybe battery sectors in that direction, I think really, and those initial policies were absolutely climate oriented. And so climate change kind of like as a reality that we are all going to be facing does kind of, I think, underlie a lot of the actual developments and lead to the expectations that these will be industries of the future that thus the Chinese government should invest in as opposed to other technologies, right? They're not investing in like horse-drawn carriages because that's an old technology that we don't talk about anymore. And so I do want to kind of like remember that climate as a concern is a significant piece of all of this, and China as a place is a country that is likely to suffer dramatically from the various kind of threats of climate change, as we've already seen in various disasters, as well as just sea level rise. Being in Shanghai and just seeing how close you are to the water, and you're not up from the sea level that very much at all. And these are massive cities with massive industrial and infrastructure, commercial real estate, what have you, and that there's just a real vulnerability there in China. And then beyond that, though, I think I will just again emphasize that we shouldn't think about climate action as some morality play where it's like only those who are sacrificing are just and good. So I don't want to kind of like denigrate the Chinese because they're not willing to sacrifice in a way that like we need to for climate action. Like it needs to be climate first in this like other way. I think they've pointed to and opened doors towards what I think is a much more attractive model in a world where lots of people don't have any access to electricity or any access to clean fuels at all, to a better future. And so to me, it's a real story of success that I think will accompany climate, like real reductions in emissions. So that's my hopeful bit. That's as much as I can say.
One of the things I noticed is the Chinese government, they focus on helping the EV industry to get stronger and more competitive. So to do that, they have to, they definitely need to support the industry from the very beginning. But then at the later stage, especially after 2020, they need to reduce their subsidies for the EVs and ask those companies to compete each other. And in fact, as a matter of fact, this year it's 15th five-year plan, and somebody noticed that she did, mentioned that not every city needs to develop the EV. He made a public speech about this, and then also in the 15th five-year plan, the EV was not included in the plan, but the charging station definitely was actually mentioned in the plans.
I think Christina is really right that my emphasis on solar and wind and electricity is a little bit different than the EV sector, where it really, I think this geopolitical security, kind of energy security, fear, Strait of Malacca, all these things, right? That China is a major oil importer and is worried about in a potential security conflict with the United States, that the United States might cut off access to oil, and that would be quite dangerous to the Chinese economy and the Chinese society, Chinese military kind of possibilities. And so there is a difference in sector. And I think that's always, that's often the case in China, that it's important to think about each individual sector because they really do differ. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot to say that the Chinese government is willing to contemplate change and kind of like imagine a different, like China is, and in part because China was a very poor country in the relatively recent past. Climate is significant. It is not something that I think is talked about all of the time and is not the emphasis politically. Even natural disasters that occur inside of China are rarely framed as climate related in the way that we talk about often in the West. And I think that's interesting. Even though China is acting, it doesn't really maybe want to talk about this. It doesn't want to have a bottom-up pressure on for more action on climate change than it's familiar with, probably because of it. The climate action is tempered by all of these other concerns, economic and industrial policy related, as Christina suggested. So climate politics is a is not something that is front and center in the Chinese political space. It is something that is incidental to these industries that they're excited to support and are happy globally to claim credit for, but is not, it's not a deep conversation where industries or localities are really debating their future about, are we going to have to leave because of like climate risks, or are our industries going to have to shut down because of like climate concerns? Those are conversations that the Chinese government is not interested in having today and is pushing off as far as it can.
And now my conversation with Professor Hong Li.
Now, I'm going to ask you three questions, and the first is, China's EV adoption is unmatched by anywhere else in the world. What do you think? What are the lessons that the West can take from China's rapid scale up of its both EV production, but also EV consumption? Mm-hmm. And what do you think from those lessons would apply to the West or work, and what wouldn't work to Western countries?
We should have a long-term clear target and consistent policy. Like a 24-year or even 30 years policy should be consistent, not change randomly. That's not so good for the electric vehicle development. And in order to have this kind of industry, you need to have developed the production chain from the mining and to the raw material, to the battery material, and to cell production and system integration production, and also recycling, to form a loop for the to counter the natural source, and also to produce the everything in a environment friendly way. This is a general policy, and also is well accepted by the whole society. And in order to do this, you have a well-developed production chain. You need a lot of expert. You need a lot of labor in this field. So the education becomes also very important. So in the university and for the undergraduate, for the graduate students, we have a lot of less class to train the young people to learn how to, what's the mechanism, what's the fundamental research, what's the scientific point, and what's the key technology in order to develop electric vehicle. So this number is very big. Actually, over 100,000 people, a student has been trained previously. So then you have a lot of people, a lot of experienced people to develop this kind of electric vehicle. I think in order to do this for the West country, you need to have an education system to train people to realize the value, to accept the value for the whole society. And also you need to set up, of course, the industry chain. So from the mining, from the material production, and from the cell production, and also the whole system. And also you need to have the experience how to use the battery for the different place. Because for different countries, you have different climate. Some places are very cold, some places are very hot. So for battery requirement and performance is different. So you need to have different battery design and pack design. So for this kind of things, you should have a customized production chain in order to do this.
Let me ask you, what do you think China's emissions will be in 2040 compared to today? And therefore, by what fraction will it have decreased?
So the main target is very clear. In the year of 2030, the carbon dioxide emission should be approach the peak level. And in the year of 2060 should be the carbon neutrality situation. And then, so in the year of 2040, so the carbon dioxide emission should decrease to 30 to 50% of the level of 2030. In another way is to decrease 20% compared to the 2020 emission. In the year of 2050, will be 50% only of the 2020 emission. And of course, in the year of 2060, we'll keep the neutrality. So that's a general prediction and based on a lot of issues, of course. So based on the technology and based on the development status of the solar cell and also the wind energy. And the last month, the chairperson, she has announced in the year of 2035, the renewable energy, the total installed capacity, including the solar cell and the wind energy, is 3,600 gigawatt hour, or you can call it 3.6 terawatts. So that's a big level. It's 6 times higher than the installed capacity in the year of 2020. So if you have such kind of scale of the renewable energy, you need a lot of energy storage technology, and you need also a lot of battery for developing the electric vehicle. That's our the target from the 2030, 2040, 2050, and 2060. So it's roughly, it's actually very clear. But of course, it's not so easy to reach those kind of targets. But this become a national policy, has already accepted in the different level document.
What extent is China's energy transition driven by climate goals versus industrial policy, energy security, and geopolitical competition? And I expect that it will be driven by all of those things, but would love to hear what you think.
Yeah, this is a good point, good question. At the beginning, so the climate change and climate policy proposed by the West scientists, this kind of general idea has been accepted by all the people, or most people, and the policy decision people in the China. Climate target become the leading policy. So, but of course, in order to realize those targets, you have a lot of other benefit. For example, right now, the electric vehicle car and the lithium battery and the solar cell become the top 3 direction for the export to the other countries. The product to the export. So because those kind of product are really good for the whole world to change the climate, to use the clean energy and to use a lot of technology and save and improve the energy efficiency, utilization, and also this kind of general policy has not been accepted by each country, So some country has different idea, still think the fossil energy is really important. But in our country, we will decrease the thermal power station amount. And after 2030, so most of the thermal power station were converted or transformed into the flexible tune power station, because introduction of the renewable energy will challenge the grid systems. So in order to develop a smart grid, so the thermal power station, together with the renewable energy and with the hydropower station, to form a new structure of the energy. So for that reason, so we need to change the industry structure. And so it's not bad. It's really, you need a lot of new technology, new science, new production.
David, Sara, how are you doing?
Good.
Great to be here. A little tired to be here.
Yeah. It's a Friday, just to timestamp this. So by now, keen EvC listeners will have listened to 3 interviews, including one interview with a couple of Chinese experts. Let's start, Sara. You think of all the interviews now, and maybe, what are 1 to 2 cross-cutting things that you learned from all of the interviews?
One of the things that I think shows up in a lot of the conversations is that what China has done sounds to me a lot like good industrial policy. And, maybe this is the typical example of somebody having a favorite topic and turning everything back to that, which I might be guilty of when it comes to industrial policy. But I think there were a number of things that were mentioned by different folks that we talked to around this idea of like a lot of government support at the beginning, whether it was around, the first, I've forgotten exactly the details, whether it's the 1,000 EVs or the limited number of cities. So more government involvement. The government involvement, upstream, this like building strong universities to create capabilities that are really quite directed. So not sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall around a lot of different things, but picking out this, electrification of transportation because it has various energy security implications, focusing on it. And then at some point sort of getting out of the way, right? And we heard these themes of like, yes, there is this government support, but I think what was really new to me was learning how much of the recent developments have really been driven by, sort of capitalist-like competition adapted to the local environment. So, you have a lot of people with apartments, so you're looking at how do you create charging stations there, might look slightly different in other places. But I think that to me is not a bad description of what I heard from, the three different groups of folks we talked to.
What really jumps out to me is with China's energy transition and everything it's doing on batteries, on renewable electricity, on EVs, is how unromantic the story is. It's not, across interviews, what came through to me is that China's success is not at all ideological, it's institutional. And that's whether it's Christina talked about EV charging, Jeremy on market competition, Andrew on energy security, Hong talked about batteries and grids. The common thread is really the state capacity to set direction, I think, tolerate failure, and then scale ruthlessly when they figure out that something works. And we in the West, often we're kind of arguing about motives and a little bit about consumer virtue or green identity. And China is just, rolling up sleeves and building systems.
Yeah, I think what seems clear is that China is able to do a kind of adaptive management of at least some kinds better than the West now. So at least my understanding, which I don't still think I'm that confident about, is that it's not like they had a grand plan for solar. To some extent, Germany started their giant feed-in tariff, and then that started to drive solar demand up, and some Chinese companies started to do really well. And then the government kind of came in on top and said, wow, these companies are doing well. We'll give them a bunch of support. This is a thing we want at a national level. And then it drove. And this is part of a broad strategy that says the Chinese government identifies some areas where they want to compete. Those do become priorities. Resources move towards them. But inside that competition, inside that area, they can have really vicious competition.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is, like, again, to me, that doesn't necessarily sound like something that couldn't be or even hasn't been replicated, say, in the US, maybe Canada less so. I think we have been less good, honestly, at kind of good industrial policy. But also that willingness to, like Ed was saying, sort of walk away from things that don't work, right? There was a little bit of a blast from the past for me in Andrew's comments about coal to liquids, of like, wow, yeah, I remember when people were talking about that. And from a climate perspective, man, it sure is a good thing that didn't end up, being competitive with some of the other options, at least as far as I know now. So that kind of, this idea of like, did we end up where we are with China targeting where it is on climate because of, as you said, this sort of philosophy versus like we sort of got lucky that this is the way things worked out in the world?
I mean, the coal gasification could have been done with CCS. I was involved with a bunch of folks at Princeton who were involved with the Chinese people, a bunch of senior people in China, energy planners, and there was serious talk about it. And that was an energy independence play because it would have turned coal into either liquids to compete in the liquid fuel market or into gas or hydrogen, and that would have decarbonized or not. That would have reduced local air pollution and reduced the sensitivity to foreign oil and gas imports. And that was a sort of, I think, a plausible strategy. And what's cool is that as that strategy became less relevant because renewables got really cheap, they just moved away from it.
And it's a little bit different then, right? Like some examples I can think of, in our neighboring province where there's still discussion about, extending the Boundary Dam coal with CCS project. So,
I think if you want to talk CCS, you definitely have to listen to our recent live show when we expanded upon pathways. But I want to come back to the competition point, because Yeah, as I said, it's not about consumer virtue or green identity and some of the things that we seem to see in the West, well, particularly in North America. It's chargers everywhere. And I'll have to pull up the exact number, but Christina talked about the number, compared and contrasted the number of chargers in China versus what we have in the West. And it's a shocking difference.
Some thousand in Canada versus a million plus there.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of that kind of change, delta. And it's brutal competition. And so you actually have a lot of firms dying along the way. And that's, I think, a pretty different starting point of how we talk about or how we deal with EVs here in the West. So chargers were everywhere. You had EVs, cars got cheap very fast. And as a result of that, the firms are really pushed into this brutal competition that allowed the creme de la creme to actually rise to the top. And so the behavior, the adoption was really about following infrastructure and price and not the other way around. And I think that's quite unique. It's an uncomfortable lesson, I think, for Western climate policy and all these EV mandates, or now we got rebates or everything that we're still trying to throw into it to try to increase adoption that have increased adoption, but we've hit a bit of a plateau, whereas China just keeps on going up.
Yeah, I think there's a subtlety under the charger numbers, right? If you look at somewhere like Norway, where there's maybe in some ways more similarities, at least to the kind of demographic where people are living, where I think there the story is more, you had like more EVs first that people were charging in their private homes and be able to use, like a plug that they could get in their garage kind of thing. And so, certainly the Chinese lots of chargers in the shared spaces, I think is a very important pathway for somewhere, some of the other countries that we've talked about where, people are maybe more living in high-rise buildings. I do think that in places like Canada, having the EVs available is key, but there is a little bit of a maybe other direction to the chicken and egg where you get the EV adoption first. I'm not just randomly actually saying this too. I've done some modeling recently with a postdoc led by a postdoc that I work with, Omid, which kind of has showed that that's the case, at least in the Norway example. But that competition and the willingness to let sort of the losers or those that aren't competitive fall by the wayside, I think is also a really key piece of that adoption. And, where that's harder, I think in Canada is where we do have all those incumbents, right? And I think Jeremy mentioned this, if you have startup like EV manufacturers who are willing to sell EVs for very low profits, which I think we're very familiar with from the startup culture in general, they're going to be able to make, cheaper EVs than an incumbent who doesn't want to cannibalize their own internal combustion engine business to sell EVs. So, I think there's some good reasons we've seen that faster adoption.
So my comment about them turning away from coal gasification when they saw it wasn't the future is wrong. I took the time to actually look this up. So there's actually was an 18% expansion of coal gasification just in the last year. There's a bunch of big projects. So this idea of really building it out for chemicals and for gas, synthetic gas for cities seems like it's a real thing. And I think what maybe I get from that is what they're shifting away from is straight coal combustion for electricity as solar comes in, but using that coal from this, I think, this biggest mine in the world for coal gasification projects, which plug directly into chemicals and fuels where they don't have another easy substitute.
I wonder, David, just from your conversation with Andrew and given his vantage point from within the U.S. government, and let's take EVs, did he see China's EV success as something that was deliberately engineered from the top? Or was it more that the state kind of recognized, to use the Canadianism, saw where the puck's going, even a little late, but then they just supercharged it? So I got the sense from Hong that he thought their success around not just EVs, but renewables and batteries, that they kind of made this bet in the early 2000s, and that bet really could have gone sideways, that he implied that there is a certain degree of and hopefully I'm not falsely attributing this to him, that there is a bit of a luck associated with where the world went, but then they supercharged everything. What was Andrew's take?
I think that's consistent with Andrew's take. I think the interesting thing that Andrew and I spent some time on is nuclear, where nuclear is a different case, where it doesn't seem, and that was a really interesting thing he said, that they're thinking that much about export, but they really are building out their domestic industry. And he, as I kind of hinted at, he's probably limited to what he can say. He's been involved in some of these negotiations because basically they're building the Westinghouse AP1000, but that's not what they call it. But there's a bunch of IP that is in the main reactor they're building. And they really do seem to be building them out, and now quite a pace. It's part of the reason the world's overall nuclear output is now higher than ever and growing faster than it has in a long time. And I think that's interesting because that feels like a different case. It's not straight capitalism. It is a state decision, but it's not a state decision driven around exports.
As opposed to what they're doing in the solar market. It's not driven around exports. What kind of struck me from the interview is if you take Chinese industrial policy, we tend to, and I think Western analysts tend to sort of tease it apart. This is what they're doing on geopolitics. This is what they're doing on energy security. This is what they're doing to decrease oil dependence. This is what they're doing as an export strategy. And I think everything they're doing takes it all into account in their whole energy transition. So EVs originally, it's about decreasing reliance on foreign oil, and that's just in their geopolitical and security interests. What they've done with the renewables is they've also made their grid a lot more resilient. What they've done with driving down the cost of solar panels, they've, taken everyone out and they become the breadbasket for solar panels. And it's all intertwined: geopolitics, security, export dominance, and ultimately, and not to dismiss that the Chinese themselves understand the climate science. We haven't really talked about it. They're not do-gooders. They recognize the climate science, and David, you'd be closer to this than me. But my understanding is they know that, for instance, in China, if you disrupt the monsoon season, that in certain parts of China, that's going to have, really negative impacts. So they understand that.
For sure. I mean, no question. But I think they were rational that air pollution and other pollution was a much bigger issue than climate. So I think that's been systematic. And I think that's something you saw from Andrew. The 5-year plans focused on electrification. They focused on pollution and on these kind of energy security things. And to some extent, climate was something that rode along on the pollution focus. I think that may be changing now. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I think that was the correct decision in the sense that pollution was really killing a huge number of Chinese people.
I was going to say there's a lot of similarities, David. I mean, again, it feels sort of like, oh, well, we shouldn't be shocked that really, in the end, the stories have a lot of similarities between Canada and China, is we're all just people. But the same kind of thing, I think, happened here when you look at the coal phase out, right? It was the local pollution and the kids, reduction in number of kids having asthma attacks and having to go to the hospital that really carried the public support for the coal phase out in Alberta. So it's sort of, to me, that's just a more general point that it's a lot easier for governments to tackle local pollution and be able to say, we're doing this thing because of this impact that you can see directly.
Yeah, I think what's different is the role of NGOs, where at least in the U.S. coal world, there's no question that some NGOs who were primarily worried about climate, but they were also worried about pollution, pushed some specific things like the mercury rules that would add to the cost, where the conversion cost would be especially high, which helped to push some coal plants out over the edge, kill them off as gas got cheap. So there was a kind of a squeeze play pretty rationally by the NGOs. I was on the EPRI Scientific Advisory Board at the time. I saw some of this where the NGOs, did actually care about mercury, but they wouldn't have done this if it was just mercury pollution. But they pushed that added mercury rule to add another $100 a kW the coal people had to spend just as gas was getting cheap to put a bunch of the coal plants offline, which was, I think, a great strategy. But in that sense, it's different because the NGOs had significant role that wasn't coming from government.
And the NGOs were given a significant role in the way that the Chinese government would tolerate, which is you can do a lot of things, you can push for that just as long as you don't cross the line of actually criticizing the government, and then you're going to lose your social license to operate, or worse. I was there in 2014 and gave a talk at the China University of Petroleum, but there was a room full of graduate, PhD, and undergraduate students who were all specializing in Canadian energy, and a room full. So the professor who brought me in, he put it quite quaintly. He said, listen, under the one-child policy, if you're only allowed to have one child, you become very partial to that child's health. So if that child gets sick because of respiratory illness, then you get really upset, and you have the capacity to get upset because now you've got a bunch of urbanites who have entered the middle class, and they expect a middle-class lifestyle, and that includes their one child not dying prematurely from respiratory illness. So it was a confluence of factors that allowed it to move pretty decisively. I would want to pivot just because Hong talked about the sheer number of people in China who are involved in the supply chain, but also the degree of training that they have. And that reminded me of that cup story, where if they're going to go on something, in this case, it was looking at Canadian energy. And they're all befuddled by why we couldn't get pipelines built to the West Coast at the time, I remember. But they just bring a tremendous amount of resources to bear, and you have a lot of people working on it. So the China University of Petroleum was a university focused on petroleum solely. That's what it did. And it had, a large student population. And I think they've done the same with that with EVs, not up and down the supply chain, but they just have an incredible number of people who are looking at it, solving, innovating, and failing, and then starting the whole process again. And I don't think we have nothing close to that capacity here in North America.
Maybe not on that topic. I mean, I work at a university that basically got its start as that version of that for the oil industry in Canada, right? And so that again, and you have examples. I mean, I'm really not an expert of that, but you have examples of universities across the U.S. that also were stood up to be focused agricultural and land grant universities and things like that. So again, I guess I hear and see a lot of similarities from what we heard in these interviews to things that we have done or seen done, say, in Canada when it comes to, the oil, the support and kind of development of people that can then go into the oil sector and build that. I wouldn't say that is unique. I would just say that, again, there is a focus now on that battery piece from China in a way that we're not seeing, say here. But I also thought it was super interesting to hear, just how focused there is and how many people. I mean, one of the other things that came through, I think, across a number of the interviews was just this idea that the peak, and we can debate whether it will be exactly this year or next year or in 5 years, but that there really is a peak and stabilization and some kind of decline to China's emissions, which is also a really big change from, how things have been going. It's not that, there was this sort of significant rise that's just going to continue forever. And I think that's sometimes missed a little bit in the discussion about China and climate.
Yeah, I think there's very wide agreement that we really will see emissions go down. The only question is how quickly they'll go down. I like the fact that it sounded like you said admissions, and that gets us to Chinese social policy or other questions of freedom of speech. But let's stick with emissions.
Well, and Frank, so when I talked to Hong about it, he laid out a pretty explicit trajectory of emissions peaking around 2030, down sharply by 2040, roughly half by 2050. And it's all tied to what we've talked about: renewable capacity, grid reform, storage, EV deployment. And I have the sense that these targets are pretty normalized inside China's planning system, that they're not aspirational, they're assumed. But at the same time, and Hong, if you're listening, I don't mean to offend you, but he was attacking pretty close to the party line. And so what I heard was what is state policy, in a way that I think your interviews, they're allowed to deviate a bit more from the party line. And that's just, I think, being an academic in China, that's just a constraint that you have to deal with. And in my discussion with Hong, it was, very interesting, super helpful, and everything was towing very close to the party line.
That is the reality. Back to the admissions as opposed to the emissions.
Gotta go have to check the transcript. I guess I misspoke there.
Oh, it was, I'm just teasing you. It was probably halfway in between. That's what my ear picked up. It was, no, you were trying to say the right thing.
Any surprises? Or we kind of started with cross-cutting themes, but, any kind of aha moments you got out of the interviews?
Well, one that I was pretty it's not directly actually about China at all, but Andrew, who's been very senior in a bunch of Democratic administrations, so he was like helped negotiate Paris under Obama, and then he ran this track 2 on China with WRI during Trump 1, and then he was the top foreign policy person at DOE under Biden. He had several positive things to say about what Trump was doing that kind of surprised me, about kind of like their industrial policies actually doing something. That was part of his response to my question about what, have we lost the competition for everything? And if so, if not, what are the things we're most likely to successfully compete in? And I think his answer, which was that very unlikely to successfully compete with PV, but batteries there's more chance to compete in. And I think that matches what I've heard from other people, because there's such a range of different battery technologies. I think there's still room for the US to find some niches where they succeed in.
Sara, what about you?
Yeah, what were surprises? I think a lot of them we've talked about already, but I think just the degree of competition that was happening along a lot of these lines within China. I mean, I had sort of heard it in terms of the solar panels and the idea that, a lot of solar panel manufacturers in China are actually not making a lot of money necessarily. I think that still kind of surprises me every time I hear it. I think also some of that shift and stabilizing in, and maybe it's just a reflection of how much time is passing, but just this idea of the image of China and what the focus is and sort of what's going on there for me is probably some kind of integration over, the last 20, 30 years of my knowledge about China, and just being reminded again that is really not accurate anymore as a reflection of what things are looking like there now. That you really have, to some extent, this story of rapid development and growth, economic growth, but that at some point it does start to slow down naturally in some ways, and that leads to a lot of changes on other things as well, including emissions.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't really, with China in my interview at least, talk about the demographic cliff. And China is about to go off that cliff, and partly a result of the one-child policy. And we'll see if they're able to keep chugging along with a lot less people 20, 30 years from now than what they're relying on right now. I think for me, the takeaway was it really is a systems story. It's really about long-term policy, putting infrastructure first, brutal competition, and then really a willingness to experiment at scale. And the difficult question, I think, for the West is it's not whether we like or don't like China's approach. I think you're hearing all of us express a little bit of fandom around China's approach. It's, are we willing to learn from them, and what parts can you actually take and adopt here? And that to me is still a pretty big question mark.
I was just going to respond to that. What can you apply here? And I think, I would love to see us do good industrial policy, like I always say. But I think we do have to wrestle with the fact that we have, because Canada saw more economic development earlier on, we have a certain incumbent industry that's built around a more fossil-based system. And so that is going to naturally make it harder to do some of these things.
I don't see that as being the dominant thing that makes it harder. So I do think there's lots to learn. I think we don't want to replicate everything. China has had some terrible policies regarding both pollution and human rights, but I think that we could be much smarter about industrial policy, about managing capitalism better. And, as much as we all talk and think a lot as Albertans about the oil industry, in terms of Canada's total size of Canada's economy, I don't think it fundamentally is the constraint that making Canada do badly on, say, growth. In fact, the productivity of the fossil fuel industry has been growing pretty well. I think Canada has a bunch of deep structural problems about the way decisions get made, our inability to let dying industries die, some inability to foster innovation, inability to get this kind of competition. And I don't think it's the fossil fuel sector that mostly holds us back. I think it's some complicated set of complacency and institutional culture in Canada and other Western countries is doing it.
Yeah, I will say, when I was giving that China University of Petroleum talk, as I say, they were astounded that not only we weren't getting pipelines done, but they weren't getting LNG export terminals done. And they kept asking, why? why? Like, why does it take you years? And I said, well, that's part of our democracy and our particular form of democracy. And I think on this show, and certainly during our live show that we recently taped, I think we agreed that we've allowed too much red tape to creep into the system, and that's really slowed us down. And people may like Mark Carney, they may knock him, but everything that I get from his government is he's really trying to cut down on some of that red tape because we've over-engineered it.
I do think, though, I mean, David, I wonder to what extent we're sort of saying some of the same things, because to me, a lot of those like structures and the way that decisions get made on where, say, funding goes for specific projects or what types of projects, I think that there is a really large influence that the incumbent industry has through, its ability to do large scale lobbying and really just be in front of policymakers, over and over again. And I mean, I want to be clear, like I don't think I'm saying anything that's unique to Canada or to the incumbent industry that we have. I think this is like a pretty well documented, well understood that incumbent industries will use their power and their wealth to protect themselves. And so I think that dynamic, plays out in why that is happening.
100% agree. Where I think I was disagreeing is I wasn't thinking the fossil fuel industry particularly was a big reason Canada's failing to say, the basic lack of productivity growth in Canada. But let me just kind of go wild speculating here. I mean, I think there are some ways that Canada's more challenged. And it's something maybe particular to the relatively small number of provinces spread out in a line with kind of regional industrial foci. So that, BC with its pulp and some oil and gas, and then obvious what Alberta is, but like that aerospace cluster in Quebec. And then there's some way where each of these things kind of becomes provincial champions. And because in some way that it feels a little different, I think, on the one hand, from the US, that's just much bigger with many more states, and it's more easy to move stuff around. There's less kind of that kind of regionalism. And again, different from like a small European country, out of like France or Finland, just it's a different situation. I think there is more of a built-in way where Alberta is obviously, I think, too dominated by fossil fuels, but in the same sense, some of the lock-in stuff in Quebec is too dominant, and then the federal government caters to both in a way that I think is part of Canada's problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's fair. I think maybe we're probably much closer then on what those issues are. And I mean, certainly I think there's been a lot of interesting things written about the challenge of really innovation and not just coming up with ideas, but really growing them in a place where you have naturally a small number of customers right near you, right? And so there's always this attraction to like going to, say, U.S. centers where you can be closer to a large number of customers. And I mean, I've heard stories about the way that kind of impacted, how Canada's automobile sector was set up and why we have all this manufacturing. And, we should probably have a whole show on this separately, because there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, when you're answering Sarah's or rebutting Sara, I saw you give a thumbs up, and then suddenly my Zoom screen filled with all these floaty thumbs up emojis with your name on them. And that's disturbing enough for me to want to actually bring this conversation to a close. I'd also say that there's a brew pub with a seat with my name on it right now and a bunch of friends there, and it's late Friday. So thanks. Why don't we leave it at that? And I hope people enjoyed this special episode. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emmett Tandon with help from Michael Edmonds. Our title and show music is The Wind Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with the support of the North Family Foundation, the Conscon Foundation, the Trache Family Foundation, and you, our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help new listeners to find the show. We'll be back in early March with a new episode on the climate pros and cons of artificial intelligence. See you then.